Hello everyone, this video I will be showing you how we put together our box pleated advent calendars at the shop. They are really easy and fun to make, and the techniques I will show you can be applied to a lot of panels and projects. So the first step is to cut around the panel. I am cutting out my pockets first along the solid lines, leaving at least 1/4 of an inch seam allowance around the pocket design. Then I go ahead and cut around the main panel piece, leaving 1/4 of an inch seam allowance again. This is the fabric I chose for the first border. I square off an edge first, then cut the border pieces the desired size, adding seam allowances again. I think I cut these at 3.5 inches wide for a 3-inch finish. I attach the border to the short sides first in case I don't have enough length to go around the whole thing. I always pin them before they are sewn in case the fabric stretches during sewing. Off camera, I press the seam allowance open and then cut off the excess. I go ahead and stitch the other short side border on. When I went to do the longer sides, I found I was a little short on fabric. I miscalculated at the counter. I decided to join my excess pieces instead of buying more fabric. You can do this if you don't mind a join in your border, but something with a very big defined print could make your join more obvious, which you would want to avoid. After I sew the fabrics together, I cut the seam back to 1/4 of an inch and press it open for a neat finish. Then I go ahead and sew the other borders on and cut off the excess. This will be the second border fabric. I cut these at 1.5 inches for a 1-inch finish and sewed them on the same manner I sewed the previous border pieces. Now it is time to iron the wadding of your choice. I like to use the single-sided fusible pellin. While ironing this on, start from the middle and work your way outwards. I did this off camera. Now returning to the pocket pieces. At Milan's, we like to stabilise the pockets with a fusible woven interfacing. This provides us with structure. This was something I should have ironed on before I cut the pockets out individually, but I forgot to do it. Therefore, it just means I have given myself more work to do than I needed. When ironing these onto the interfacing, I used this special applique mat to prevent the glue from sticking to the iron. I went ahead and recut all the pockets. You can see the structure now. When cutting the lining for the pockets, I measured how wide the pockets were and just used that measurement or slightly smaller to cut the lining. I think these were 3 inches wide. I lay these right sides together and pinned along the top edge of the pockets. When I go to sew this, I sew from the side where I can see the pictures on the pockets, so I know my stitch will fall right on the edge of the picture. Once I have sewed that edge, I want to do a nice understitch to form a perfect fold. I will sew 2 mm in from the edge of the seam onto the lining and ensure that the seam allowance stays folded towards the lining to do this properly. Here I am sewing the single pockets onto the one strip of lining to save time. Really, I shouldn't have cut into the rows until after this step was done if I really wanted to save time. You can also understitch all this too. I press the top edge of the pockets and then cut the lining like so to form the pocket. Here I am explaining how the instructions want you to cut on the solid lines and to not cut on the dash lines, as these will create the box pleated pockets. Next is to press all the edges. This part is important as it creates a really defined edge for you to top stitch later. First, I open the pocket and press the short edges in individually. If you are really picky, press the lining side in slightly narrower so you have no chance of it poking out when top stitching. Then I bring the two long edges together and press the short sides again. Then I iron under the bottom edge with both lining and the main pocket fabric as one. Using the steam function on your iron helps set all these folds in place. Now I am going to show you how these pockets are sewn on. I did a few already to see how they would turn out. I did try to bag out one pocket piece, but this gave a really rough finish, believe it or not, and was harder to actually do, so I am a firm believer of the pressing method instead. Anyway, back to sewing on the pocket. First we have to stitch down the middle of the pair to separate the pockets and hold in place. I always start a little bit further down from the top and reverse till my needle has dropped off the edge and come back down to create a firm lock stitch. Once the middle is sewn, I arrange the pocket where I want it and top stitch it in place. When I sew the bottom of the pocket, I fold the pleat so it lines up with the center. Then I stop sewing and fold the other pocket pleat to the center and make sure I hold these layers in place really well as I am sewing over them. The pressure from the foot can move them out of alignment. Use a stiletto if you need to. Sewing on the single pockets is the same but no pleat involved, so essentially it's easier. I had a lot of fun sewing on these pockets. This is my backing fabric. I pressed it first and laid it flat on the table. Then I neatly placed the panel on top and pinned it in place with curved safety pins. I didn't bother with basing spray as such because I'm not going to quilt a lot of this and it is reasonably small. I decided to complete the first quilting stitch while also sewing on a nice braid. Then the second row of quilting was a stitch in the ditch on the second border piece. Also keep in mind to change your bobbin colour to a dark blue or whatever your backing fabric is. Then I sewed at the edge of the white border to hold all these layers together for when the panel is cut back and the binding goes on. It is important to press this first and pin it like mad before you do this stitch to ensure the fabric doesn't warp or slide out of place. Put on a walking foot if you are having issues. I had to use the applique mat to press mine to make sure the little edges were firmly pressed to the wadding. As you can see, the fabric is sitting nicely between the quilting lines. Now I am cutting back the backing and wadding. Here I am deciding how wide to make my hanger. You can sew the hanger onto the backing fabric first to prevent any stitching from sewing on the right side, but I did mine afterwards. This means I need to carefully consider where the stitching line is sewn and cut my hanger accordingly. I cut twice the width as I am going to fold it in half, but I also cut 1/4 of an inch more than I needed to allow for a bit of excess fabric for when it hangs on the rod. Then I roughly measure how long it needs to be, keeping in mind the edges will be folded in as a 1/2 inch double hem. I like to have it within the width of the panel by about 1 to 1.5 inches. I top stitch the double hem so it doesn't get caught when sliding the hanger in. Next I open up the hanger and line it up with the top edge of the panel and place it somewhat central. Then I will be stitching it in place at the top edge and midway through the hanger to create the casing. Like I said before, I keep in mind how I want the hanger to sit with a bit of extra fabric and not entirely flat to make room for the rod. Before I sew down the middle of the hanger, I make sure it is flat and pin it down from the right side. I'll go ahead and sew through the middle, ensuring I lock off at the start and end for extra stability. Once sewn, I bring the long edge back up to the top and sew it down in place with a small seam allowance. Next, I cut my binding strips into 2 3/4 of an inch wide and join them all together like I join the border. Then I cut back the join seam allowance, press it open and iron it in half. Now I start stitching the binding from the wrong side, about 3 inches in from the tail, and check my seam allowance choice will cover the raw edge comfortably and the row of stitching. I had to sew with a seam allowance of about 10mm, which is bigger than 1/4 of an inch. When I get to the end, I fold the short end of the tail to align with the longer edge. This creates a nice angular fold like if you were to join it on the fold without sewing it. Then I bring the other part of the binding over and cut about 1 centimetre more than where the fold ends and tuck that loose end into the angular folded part. Then I sew through. Next I press the binding upwards to make the next step look really crisp. At the machine, I fold over the binding so it just covers the stitching line you made from sewing it on the back. At the corners, I fold it like so and use different tools to hold the fold in place. It's up to you how you would like to do this. The best tips I can give are to fold the binding in a way where the bulk matches the back and the front, and make sure the needle lands in the down position through both layers of the binding before you turn the corner to ensure no gap is left. Once the binding is done, you are finished. The box pleats have turned out great, and I hope you actually learned something from this video. We sell a lot of these panels at our store and our online shop, and I hope you find something you like. Thanks for watching.